Hello and welcome to our webinar on managing conflicts of interest. I'm Sam Laurie, the ACNC's Guidance and Education Manager, and with me today is Lucas Ryan, who's a Senior Education Officer at the ACNC, and Shirley Southgate, our Director of Legal and Policy. Welcome, Lucas and Shirley.
Hello. Hi, Sam.
Also joining us is Charlene from our advice team, who will be answering any questions you may have along the way through the question box. Hi, Charlene.
Hi.
A recording of this webinar and the transcript and the slides will be available on our website within a few days of the webinar. If you have any difficulties with the sound on your computer, try calling the phone number listed in the GoToWebinar control panel. Finally, we value any suggestions you have to improve our webinars in the future, so please pass on your suggestions in the survey at the end of this session. Throughout this webinar, you'll be able to ask questions using the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. We'll be able to answer your questions directly, but if we think the answers would be useful for everyone, we can also respond in a way that will allow everyone to see the question and also the answer, but not who asked it. Please let us know if you'd like your question to remain private. If there are questions we can't answer today, we'll provide answers later. We'll also allow some time for some questions at the end, after the formal presentation has finished, and we'll stay online to chat. I just want to make a quick note that while we try to answer every question, if your question relates to the specific circumstances in your charity, for example whether you have a conflict of interest in a particular situation, it's unlikely that we'll be able to answer these in this webinar. If you have a question like this, it may be a good idea to contact us after this webinar for more detailed advice by emailing us at advice@acnc.gov.au or calling us on 132262. Lucas, if I'd never heard of the ACNC before today, how would you explain what it does and what its role is?
Well, I'd probably start by looking at what the ACNC does. The ACNC is Australia's national independent regulator of charities. As a specialist regulator of charities, have a number of functions. Our primary function is to register charities. Charities registered with the ACNC are able to say that they've met our requirements for registration and, once registered, can then apply for charity tax concessions and other benefits. We maintain an online database of every registered charity in Australia. This is a freely available, searchable and used by the public, potential donors and volunteers, grant makers and the government. There is an increasing awareness of the ACNC register, and it is now being used as a checking tool when, for example, government agencies are reviewing applications for funding. We also provide advice, guidance and education to charities on their obligations to the ACNC. Advice is available via our phone line, email and mail service, and our guidance and education is accessible in print, online and face-to-face formats. We also regulate charities by reviewing their compliance with our reporting and notification requirements, our governance standards and other requirements. We look into concerns about charities raised by the public and other government agencies. And finally, we have a responsibility in all of our work to try to reduce red tape for charities. We do this by ensuring that our processes are as streamlined as possible, and also by working with other agencies to try and harmonise reporting and other requirements. Now let's get on to the main event. We spend a lot of time speaking with charities, and some of the most important common questions that charities have for us relate to conflicts of interest. We will explain what conflicts of interests are and provide some information about how they can be managed appropriately through this webinar. But before we begin, I just want to make the point that conflicts of interest are common and they do not need to represent a serious issue for your charity. Indeed, most board members will encounter a conflict of interest at some point in their time on a board. This is why the ACNC has developed this new guide, Managing Conflicts of Interest. The guide covers the same content as this webinar, but in more detail, and it focuses on how to identify, prevent and manage conflicts of interest. It's loaded with useful case studies and tips on how to confidently and effectively respond to conflicts of interest when they arise. We encourage you to take a look at this guide and to share it with anyone involved with your charity that might find it to be useful. It's available at acnc.gov.au/publications. So, Shirley, can you tell us, what is a conflict of interest?
Thanks, Lucas. It all begins with your duty to your charity. As a board member, your first duty is to always act in the best interests of the charity. Of course, board members are people with numerous families, social and business relationships. These relationships can be greatly beneficial to the work of a charity. These relationships and other interests that board members have can sometimes conflict with their duty to act in the best interests of the charity. When this happens, competing interests may make it difficult or even impossible for you to discharge your role as a board member. This is called a conflict of interest. So managing these conflicts is important for a number of reasons. Perhaps most importantly, as a board member, a conflict of interest can result in a breach of your duties, particularly your duty to always act in the best interests of the charity. This is the first duty for board members, and poorly managed conflicts of interest can result in a breach of this duty. Failing to manage a conflict of interest can also damage a charity's reputation, causing people such as donors or volunteers to question whether or not decisions made by the board have been made in the best interests of your charity, or whether the board members have the necessary expertise for their role. Charities rely on the trust of their community to do their work, and as a board member, you have a duty to protect your charity's reputation. Your charity's accountability can also be undermined by poorly managed conflicts of interest. The reason for this is that unless conflicts of interest are disclosed, the charity's members cannot hold the board to account for their decisions. Without transparency, there can be no accountability, and appropriately managing conflicts of interest is crucial to managing this. One of the hallmarks of a high-performing board is having a robust, honest conversation. Board members should feel they can rely on one another to be fair and honest, and to always act with the best interests of the charity in mind. Failing to disclose conflicts of interest could potentially undermine this trust and, over time, undermine a board's ability to engage in frank discussion. Finally, as a registered charity, Governance Standard 5 requires a charity ensure that its board members know and are held to a list of duties. One of these duties relates to the disclosure of conflicts of interest. You should be aware of these duties and ensure that your charity is complying with them.
Charities must meet a set of governance standards to be and remain registered with the ACNC. The governance standards are a set of core minimum standards that deal with how charities are run, including their systems, processes and relationships, their governance. There is plenty of information available about the governance standards on our website at acnc.gov.au/governance standards. Now, under the governance standards, Governance Standard 5 requires that charities take reasonable steps to ensure that responsible persons, that is, their board members, know and are subject to 7 specific duties. One of these duties is to disclose conflicts of interest. The duty set out in the governance standards is limited to the disclosure of conflicts of interest, including to whom you must disclose this conflict. But there are further steps you can take to effectively manage conflicts within your charity. The information covered in this webinar goes beyond your duty to disclose conflicts of interest. It explains how not only to identify and disclose conflicts, how to manage them. Your charity's board members should be aware of these duties and make sure that they're following them. In today's presentation, we will be talking with you about the 3 components of successfully responding to conflicts of interest. We'll start by discussing how to identify conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest come in many different shapes and sizes, and knowing how to identify them is the first step in successfully responding to them within your charity. We'll also talk about the steps you can take, where possible, to prevent conflicts of interest before they arise, or to minimise the impact they may have on your charity. Being proactive with conflicts of interest can help you to be more efficient and to properly respond to them. And finally, we'll discuss what you can do once a conflict of interest has arisen to make sure that it's managed appropriately.
So let's begin discussing how to identify conflicts of interest, which is the first step in effectively managing them. To help you identify conflicts of interest, it might be helpful to think about three possibilities. The first are what might be described as actual conflicts. This is where you know that your interests are actually in conflict with your duties to the charity. For example, if you are on the board of a charity that gives grants to a limited number of kindergartens, and your child attends a kindergarten that is competing for such a grant, you will have a conflict of interest that you might think of as an actual conflict of interest. Second, we have what might be described as potential conflicts. This is where you don't currently have a conflict, but in reviewing your various duties and interests, you can see that there is a potential for a conflict to arise. For example, let's say you're on the board of charity A and a staff member of charity B. You can see that your employer might, at some point in the future, seek funding from charity A. That means there is a potential for conflict of interest to arise. Finally, there are perceived conflicts of interest. This is where you may not necessarily have a conflict, but an outsider might perceive that you do. A perceived conflict of interest does not prevent you from doing your duty, but it can still damage your charity's reputation, and it is important to take them seriously. For example, if you are part of a board committee reviewing quotes for the installation of a new IT system at the charity, and you realise that one of the quotes have been provided by an organisation that employs your sister, you might believe that you can make an impartial decision in the best interests of the charity, but others might perceive that you had a conflict of interest in this matter and will be influenced to give the work to your sister's company. So there are three things in order to decide whether you do have a conflict of interest. Firstly, you need to understand what your charity's purpose is. Your charity's purpose might also be known as its mission or its objective. As a board member, you should know your charity's purpose, but it's also important to know this when deciding whether your personal interests might conflict with your charity's interests. Secondly, you should be aware of your personal interests and the interests of anyone else connected to you if you could be influenced by them. How your interests could influence your decision-making may not be apparent until a particular situation arises, but it's useful as a reflective exercise to consider what they may be. You should be aware of things such as any current or previous paid employment, any shares you own, any memberships to organisations you hold. You should also consider any similar interests, if relevant, for people you're connected with. And finally, you should be aware of your duties as a board member. We've already discussed these, but importantly, your duty to act in the best interests of your charity may disclose conflicts of interest and should be carefully considered. Remember, your duties may overlap, and several duties can be relevant to one decision. Considering these three things together will help you identify whether you have a conflict of interest. So let's consider a case study to review these in more detail.
Rajshri is a paediatrician, a children's doctor, and a member of the board of Healthy Hospital. As we previously outlined, this means that she has duties to Healthy Hospital as a board member. The hospital is considering opening a new children's clinic in a nearby town serviced by doctors from its own facility. Rajshri's private practice is located at this town, and she's concerned that if Healthy Hospital operates a children's clinic nearby, she might lose. Because Rajshri has an interest in the success of her private practice, but also a duty to act in the best interests of Healthy Hospital, she's experiencing a conflict of interests. We'll talk later in this presentation about what you can do once you have identified a conflict of interest. With an understanding of how to identify conflicts of interest, we can now consider how they can be prevented, or at least have their impact minimized when they arise through being appropriately prepared to respond to them. One of the easiest ways to prepare your organisation to effectively respond to conflicts of interest is to develop and implement a conflict of interest policy. This policy should guide the way that your organisation deals with conflicts of interest by outlining a definition of conflicts of interest so that everybody in your charity is clear about what they are and when they occur, what the expectations of your charity are about when conflicts of interest will be disclosed, and what kinds of conflicts of interest are expected to be disclosed. For example, it might set out that board members should make a comprehensive disclosure at the point of joining the board. It should also cover what the procedure for disclosing conflicts of interest is. For example, requiring that conflicts of interest are disclosed in writing or that they are recorded in a certain way. Your procedure should outline to whom the conflict is disclosed and who needs to be notified. Finally, your policy should outline how you will identify and respond to failures to disclose a conflict of interest. We have a template conflicts of interest policy available in our guide on this topic and also on our website. We'll provide you with a link to this resource at the end of the webinar. A great way to support a policy on conflicts of interest is to maintain a register of conflicts of interest. A register of conflicts of interest is a document that records any relevant interests of your charity board member and the steps that might be taken, if any, to manage them. This document assists the charity to identify any actual, perceived, or potential conflicts of interest and to ensure that they are remembered and dealt with appropriately. Your conflicts of interest policy should outline how you will use your register of conflicts of interest. The register should include who experienced the conflict, and remember, it may be more than one board member or somebody who's not a board member, what the conflict of interest was, and any relevant details as to whether it's ongoing or temporary, and the extent of the conflict, when it was disclosed, and when the board became aware of the conflict, and finally, how the conflict has been addressed, and what actions, if any, have been taken to manage it. You should keep the register of interests up to date and make sure that everyone who is required to be familiar with it refers to it often. It's a good idea to review it every few months and to ensure that the information recorded in it is current and that all the members of your charity's board know about it and are referring to it. We have also developed a template register of conflicts of interest, and we'll provide the link to this later. Your organisation's attitude and behaviour to conflicts of interest is a key factor in how successful it is at responding to them when they arise. You should aim to promote a culture of disclosure which creates an environment in which everyone feels supported to disclose and manage conflicts of interest honestly, confidently, and with transparency. The first step to promoting this culture is encouraging disclosure. There are a number of ways you can do this, but it's a good idea to explain to new and existing board members what your charity's expectations around conflicts of interest are and provide them with training on your policy and procedure around managing conflicts of interest. It may also be a good idea to provide them with access to resources such as our guide or training if they feel that they require more support. It's important that everyone on your board has a clear sense that being responsible about disclosing and managing conflicts of interest is encouraged. Next, you should facilitate disclosure of conflicts of interest where possible. Create lots of opportunity for proactive disclosure and make sure that disclosing conflicts of interest is straightforward and not a burden. Many boards begin their meetings with a standing agenda item encouraging members to disclose any conflicts of interest that may be relevant to matters being discussed at that meeting. You may also like to create a standard disclosure form that is easily accessible to board members so that recording conflicts of interest is simple and straightforward. Finally, you should disclose conflicts of interest. If you're not certain whether something might be a conflict, it's a good idea to raise it with the board and let them decide as a group. It's best to err on the side of caution, but these discussions will also help you and your fellow board members to build your knowledge and confidence in managing conflicts of interest. Together, these steps will help you build a culture around conflicts of interest that will enable you to effectively and confidently respond to them and to manage them properly when they arise.
Finally, we come to how to manage conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest are commonplace, and they do not have to present a serious issue for you or your charity if they're managed appropriately. It really is how you manage your conflicts of interest that will determine what their impact is on your charity. There are 4 steps involved in managing a conflict of interest. As a conflict of interest. We discussed earlier in this presentation some of the things you can consider when identifying whether a conflict of interest arises. Remember, it may not always be your own conflict that you identify, but potentially one of your colleagues. You should feel confident raising a concern about a conflict that somebody else may have. They may have forgotten or not realise that they have a conflict, and in a culture of disclosure, it should be appropriate to disclose and discuss conflicts of your own and others. The next step is for the board to be notified of the conflict. Some disclosures are made at board meetings, but you may prefer to put your declaration in writing prior to a meeting or at the point of becoming a member. It's important that the board are kept informed about any relevant conflicts as they arise. Next, the board will decide on the appropriate response to the conflict. Keep in mind that only the board members who do not have a conflict of interest should be involved in this discussion. Obviously, you have a conflict of interest in the outcome of a decision on your conflict of interest. And finally, once the board have decided on the appropriate course of action to respond to a conflict of interest, the board member or members with the conflict are informed of the outcome and the actions arising from the decision, if any, are recorded.
Thanks, Shirley. Now let's consider how this plays out in a couple of case studies. Monica here is a member of the board of Art Plus, a charity that promotes the arts and the work of emerging artists. The board is meeting to discuss the awarding of 3 scholarships for talented young artists to attend a prestigious arts course in Perth. Monica's stepson is one of the candidates for the scholarship, and when she realises this, she notifies the board straight away. Now this is an easy one. Do you think that Monica has a conflict of interest? Well, of course, the board of Arts Plus decide that Monica has a conflict of interest, an actual conflict of interest. She has an interest in doing the best for her stepson and in assisting him in his application for a scholarship, and she has a duty to act in the best interests of the charity by abiding by their rules for the scholarship awards and protecting the reputation of the charity by making the proper scholarship decision, even if this means her stepson is unsuccessful. They note, the board, that her relationship with her stepson may cloud her ability to reach an impartial decision about each of the applicants for the scholarship based on the merits of their application alone. Because the board needs to have a robust and honest conversation about the candidates, they also ask her to leave the room while they discuss the applications. They feel that this will enable them to have a more honest discussion, without concern for how Monica might feel about the process. After they've decided to whom they will award the scholarships, the board invites Monica to return to the room and the chairperson advises her of the outcome of the process. Art Plus makes an entry in their register of conflicts of interest about the conflict and the steps they've taken to manage it. They consider that this is especially important in this circumstance, as if anyone raised a concern about Monica's relationship to one of the applicants, the board could easily demonstrate that it had taken the appropriate steps to respond to the conflict. Let's look at another case study. This one's a little bit trickier. Robert is a board member of Smiles Incorporated, or sometimes small, called Smiles Inc. Smiles Inc. is a charity whose purpose is to brighten the lives of older Australians through undertaking home visits, arranging social outings for disengaged people, and facilitating attendance at medical appointments. Transport for these activities is provided by a large group of volunteers, largely through the use of their own private vehicles. As their service grows, Smiles Inc. are working towards purchasing a minivan for use by the charity's volunteers, which will allow them to transport more clients at once and save on fuel costs. Robert's daughter is the owner of a successful car dealership, and that has made a number of financial donations to Smiles Inc. over the years. When she learns that they're looking to purchase a van, she makes them a generous offer to sell one of her dealership's second-hand vans at a rate that is far below the market price. Robert makes the offer known to the board and also discloses that it came from his daughter and that as a result he may have a conflict of interest. However, he also suggests that his relationship with his daughter wouldn't prevent him from being impartial in any decision about such a purchase. The question is, does Robert have a conflict of interest? The Smiles Inc. board have a think about this question, and they do agree that Robert could make an impartial decision if required. They note, for example, that if they had received 3 offers for the same product, one at $30,000, one at $28,000, and another at $20,000, even someone with a conflict of interest could evaluate which of these quotes represented the best value. However, they decide that Robert has a perceived conflict of interest. Somebody who didn't have access to the information that the board had access to might think that a conflict of interest was improperly managed if Robert was involved in the decision-making process. For example, if all you knew was that Smiles Inc. had chosen to buy a van from one of their board members' children, you might think that the board had acted improperly. For this reason, the board decides that they will ask him not to participate in the discussion around evaluating the quotes or to vote on the matter. They do not consider it to be necessary for Robert to leave the room. The perceived conflicts of interest and the action taken to address it are recorded in their register of interests.
So there are a number of different actions a board can take to respond to a conflict of interest once it's been identified and declared. We might call this remedial action. Essentially, there are 3 considerations boards need to make as part of this. Should the conflicted board member, firstly, participate in the discussion around the matter in which they have a conflict, or should they refrain from participating, acting only as an observer in the situation? This is an important consideration, especially if their participation could affect the outcome of the decision. They should also consider whether the board member should even be present for the discussion, or whether they should remove themselves from the room for its duration. In some situations, the board may feel that they cannot have an open and honest discussion in the presence of the person with the conflict, and it may be appropriate to ask them to leave the room so this discussion can take place. Finally, the board will need to decide on whether the person with the conflict can vote on the matter in which they have a conflict, or whether they should abstain. Of course, not all conflicts of interest require each of these decisions to be made. If, for example, a conflict is raised, but the board evaluates that it won't impact the ability of the board member to participate, they may decide to do nothing. Or if a conflict is raised as having a potential to impact the board member, it may not be necessary to take action at the time, but to review the situation later if conditions change. However, you should keep in mind that even if a conflict will not actually influence somebody appropriately, it might be perceived that it will. So in that instance, some sort of remedial action may be appropriate for either actual, potential, or perceived conflicts of interest.
And that brings us to the end of our webinar. Just remember, you can stay in touch with the ACNC in a number of ways, particularly by subscribing to our updates via the homepage. Find out more information about the ACNC's program of webinars at acnc.gov.au/webinars and visit our multimedia page under Publications Media Centre for educational video. Call us on 13ACNC, which is 132262. Our phone lines are open between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Summer Time, and they are staffed by helpful people like Charlene who understand the charity sector and can provide advice on how charities can meet their obligations to the ACNC. Our staff are trained to give general advice on a range of topics related to the regulation of charities, You can also email them at advice@acnc.gov.au. This is a particularly good idea if your issue is complex or if you think it will need detailed consideration. And of course, we're active on social media, so you can find us on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. As promised, we've included here the links to the Conflict of Interest Guide, as well as some other useful information that may assist you in managing conflict. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us, and thank you for your questions. We hope that this has been useful to you and helped you to further your understanding of the responsibilities and opportunities that come with being a board member. These webinars run at least monthly and cover a range of topics. The next in this series will take place on the 7th of December and involve reporting to the ACNC. You can sign up to attend this webinar and any others at acnc.gov.au/webinars. A recording and transcript of this webinar and any other webinars will be available on this page as well. We're always looking for ways to improve our education products, and so we would appreciate it if you took the time to fill out the evaluation for this webinar, which will pop up when the webinar closes and can be filled out online. If you have any additional comments or questions, you can get in touch with the ACNC Education team directly at education@acnc.gov.au. Well, that's it from me in the formal presentation. We'll stay online for a while in case you have any last-minute questions. Thank you to Shirley and Lucas for joining me, and to Charlene for answering questions. Thanks also to everyone who participated, and we'll see you next time.